as Barry has indicated, as Barry is indicating, I'm in Dubai at the moment, so about 4 hours ahead. So it won't be the audience going to sleep; it'll be the speakers. But no, I'm sure not. Right, okay. My name's Les Ashton-Smith. I enjoy collecting on several thematic themes. I'm sure, like many of you here, probably too many. But my main area is Leonardo da Vinci. But I've also picked up some other scientists which I found interesting. Einstein, Newton, and tonight's topic is Piccard. I'm not sure how many people here will know much about him, but hopefully at the end of the display, hopefully a little bit of education and entertainment for you. Good start, trying to figure out how I want to advance the screen. Ah, there you are. Right, okay, Auguste Piccard and his legacy. This is a Swiss maximum card from 1939 with a portrait of Piccard issued in 1978. Some of the pictures you'll see in my presentation are either press photos or postcards that I have or are copyright Bertrand Piccard. And you'll have heard a little bit about him later on in the presentation. Right, one too many. Right, okay. Here is a picture of Auguste and his brother on the top left. His brother is Jean-Félix Piccard, and he was Augustus Antoine Piccard, born in Basel in Switzerland in 1884. His father, interesting enough, was a chap called Jules Piccard, who actually worked at the University of Heidelberg, and he was a student of a chap called Robert Bunsen. So some of you will remember the Bunsen burner. So that I thought was quite an interesting adjunct. Auguste, from a very early age, had a real interest in science and engineering, and he graduated from the Polytechnic of Zurich, later to become known as the ETH. And then later on, after his doctorate, he moved to the Free University of Brussels, ULB, where he taught until his retirement in 1954. His brother and himself were always also interested in ballooning. And there's a lovely photograph on the top right, actually showing both the brothers in the rigging of an observation balloon during World War I. The philatelic items on the page, the 3 stamps in the middle are all anniversary stamps for the universities, the ETH and the ULB, and the cover is actually a balloon post sent from Basel, Auguste's hometown. Just as a little aside, Auguste actually took part in the Gordon Bennett balloon race, which I'm sure some of you may be aware of. This is a very historic and famous balloon race, and essentially it's actually all from a common starting position. Balloons are released, and the winner is the one who gets the furthest away from the starting point. Piccard's competition that he actually entered wasn't too successful. They had a horrible storm. It was almost the last balloon race they ever held. I think he actually got about sort of 5 kilometers from the start, and it was a fairly disastrous race. But it carries on to this day. It's run very much like the America's Cup, the Sailing Cup. The winning team hosts the next balloon race. There are quite a few stamps. Poland issued a few, as you can see there, with an overprint and a little miniature sheet. And the cover is actually part of a race. And this is carried by one of the members of the British team that year and signed by the pilot. So in 1930, Piccard, with his interest in ballooning and his curiosity about the upper atmosphere, he designed a spherical pressurized aluminium gondola which could ascend to great altitude without the pilot needing to wear a pressure suit. A very important driver to this experiment and this investigation was cosmic radiation, and in order essentially to get experimental evidence in support of the theories of Einstein, which Piccard actually knew because they were actually intersecting at academic circles, because they both spent time studying in Zurich. So with support from the University of Belgium, he began his plans for this high altitude balloon flight. And what you have here are two press photographs, one of them in front of his balloon capsule, and the second one obviously describing his balloon design. Two stamps here. One is, again, the Swiss stamp from the famous portraits in '78, and one from the Ivory Coast, celebrating celebrity anniversaries in 1982. Annoyingly, it seems to keep doubling the mass. Right, okay, so here's an actual image of the capsule. It was called the FNRS-1. It was named after the Belgian Fonds National de la Recherche Scientifique, which essentially funded this project. The original capsule is on display in an Armed Forces Museum, and the second capsule is actually in the British Science Museum collection in London. It used hydrogen as the flotation gas. Helium would have been useful, but it was far too expensive in the 1930s. Here is a German postcard from 1982. It's actually a reproduction of a postcard from the 1932 launch, which was issued for the 50th anniversary of the flight. And again, you see that portrait stamp coming up. The other stamps on the page are all sort of balloon themed stamps featuring Piccard, Cambodia in '83, Laos in '83, and Monaco in 1984. People often ask me why the balloon was such an odd shape at the launch, but essentially it starts off as a pear shape and then turns spherical at the higher altitudes. This is a diagram from which I have an original copy from the periodical Astrid, published in 1933. Let's see. It seems to jump. I don't know whether it's the delays here, but there we are. That's what I wanted. The flight very nearly didn't get off the ground. They were going to take off from Germany, and the German authorities wouldn't give them permission to take off. So Piccard, being Swiss, actually approached the Swiss authorities, and they said, yes, you can launch your balloon from Switzerland. And then the Germans gave in, but they said, if you're going to do this balloon ascent, you must have a safety helmet. They didn't have any safety helmets, so Piccard very, very quickly improvised with these wicker baskets and cushions. Quite an amusing headgear. You might ask, what use could they be made of? They did actually use the basket to store instruments in the capsule, and guess what they did with the cushions they sat on? A couple of stamps there where these improvised helmets are shown. One is from Guinea, and the other one is from Madagascar. So in 1931, they took off from Augsburg in Germany, and they reached a record altitude of 9.8 miles. During this flight, they became the first human beings to enter the stratosphere, and they actually managed to gather substantial data on the upper atmosphere, including taking measurements of cosmic rays. Piccard and his co-pilot Kipfer, they're widely considered to be the first people to visually observe the curvature of the Earth. And NASA also recognized Piccard as one of the first ever astronauts because he crossed into the stratosphere aboard a pressurized vessel. A Belgian postcard is shown there, showing the King Leopold III from Belgium meeting Piccard in September 37. It was a promotional card for Victoria chocolates. And then there's a Liebig card, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, which is one of these trading cards from the meat extract company. This one actually shows King Albert of Belgium, and with Piccard showing him his capsule. As a couple of stamps on here as well, the Mongolian, South African Republic, San Marino, and St. Thomas and Principe Islands. You may ask why so many stamps were issued in 83 and 84. Well, 83 was the 200th anniversary of manned flight, and 1984 was the 100th anniversary of Piccard's birth. This is a very recent cover from Coverscape in America, just quite nice because it actually shows a little bit about the flight details, showing and it was issued for the 90th anniversary of the flight. However, it was not without adventure. In fact, they were actually thought lost, and in fact, there was a New York Times headline which actually thought that the balloonist had actually perished. There were a couple of fair sort of disasters when it went up. Firstly, the aluminium ball actually started to leak. They plugged it with Vaseline and cotton waste. And you've got to remember, in the first half an hour, the balloon had shot up nearly 9 miles. And so very, very exciting. They also, when they got to the top, they actually realized that some of the mechanism to enable them to drop failed. So essentially, while their oxygen tanks were gradually emptying, they were basically floating aimlessly over Germany, Austria, and Italy. However, luckily for them, the cool evening air actually contracted the balloon's gas and actually eventually brought them down on a glacier near Obergurgl in Austria, with about an hour's supply of oxygen to supply. There were a couple of other kind of disasters. You might see the gondola, one side was painted white, the other side was painted black. There was also a motor, and the idea was that the gondola would actually rotate with regard to the sun to try and keep the temperature at a more pleasant for the aviators. Unfortunately, it didn't work. So basically, the pilots had to suffer sub-zero to 40 degrees C, and water very quickly became scarce on the capsule, and they actually resorted to drinking some of the condensation when they were able to. Anyway, the good news was they did land successfully on this glacier. They were recovered, the bold adventurers. They couldn't get the capsule down that year, and in fact, they had to wait till the following year to recover the capsule. He continued to make further launches with Kipfer again, and then with another pilot, and eventually they got up to 23,000 meters. What you can see here is a souvenir cover and a postmark, both reflecting the landing in Obergurgl in Austria. He really became a celebrity of the time, and this is I found this super postcard, which was in 1933, so only literally within a couple of years of his record, which is a carnival float in a place called Chalon-sur-Saône, and you can actually see one of the carnival floats shows a caricature of Auguste looking out from his capsule. He went to America with the capsule, and he really became a celebrity in celebrity status. And this is probably one of my favorite pieces in my collection. This is a postcard with 3 Belgium stamps, which were launched in 32. It actually is postmarked in Antwerp, but it's actually signed by Auguste Piccard and has a Findlay, Ohio postcard on the reverse. He went to several trade fairs in America, and here's a souvenir cover of the Chicago exhibition Century of Progress, and actually has reference to a Piccard-Compton launch from that exhibition. Unfortunately, it crashed 20 minutes into the flight, but both pilots were unharmed, which was obviously good news. You have here a picture pack gum card from the 33 series in America, which is a common image, and that image of Piccard looking out of his capsule you'll see in lots of documents and stamps and various other things. A nice miniature sheet from Upper Volta in '83 shows the various altitude records reached by different balloon pilots, and it actually has Piccard's portrait. And then again, another trading card from Liebig, which is from the Conquest of the Air, which was issued in 1936. However, what goes up can go down. Piccard's interest shifted when he realized he could modify his high altitude cockpit and he could use it to descend. And he invented what he called a bathyscaphe. A bathyscaphe is essentially a free diving, self-propelled deep sea submersible, and it's suspended below a float rather than a surface cable. And the steel gondola must be built obviously to stand these great external pressures, but the actual tank, because the pressure is equalized, they use a flotation liquid and they use gasoline. So essentially you would put some, very heavy weight to allow the submersible to sink. When you get to the bottom, you would release these heavy weights and the whole ship would come back to the surface. He called it the first one FNRS-2, basically following his tradition in terms of support. And he designed it with his son, and these are chocolate poster stamps that were collectibles. And you can see here his development of his ideas and a small picture of him and his son in terms of doing it. And here's some stamps celebrating his accomplishments and up and down, and you can see stamp reflecting his truck. Well, let's have a look at the rest of the family. His brother, Jean-Félix, was also a balloonist, became a naturalized American, and with his wife continued ballooning and exploits. He was one of the first people to develop a plastic balloon. He's also the first person to introduce the idea of having pyrotechnics to remotely release sort of activating devices in aircraft, which in fact was adopted by NASA and is still used in many aeronautical applications, where the explosives and releasing the balloon or the straps or some other part of the airplane to enable it to land safely. Jean-Félix's wife, a lady called Jeanette Bridlon Piccard, was also quite a character. She was became a high altitude balloonist in her own right. She held the women's altitude record for nearly 3 decades, and very late in her life, she became a priest. She'd always wanted to be so. She was ordained in the US in the 1960s, and was one of the very first people to do so. She was in a group of 11 who were the first women to be ordained. I wish the slide. Again, continuing the family connection, Jean-Luc's son, a chap called Don Piccard, was also quite a famous balloonist. He founded the American Balloon Association, also had some patents in balloon, and he was actually one of the first people to actually cross the British Channel in a balloon. Here we have a souvenir card from an event in the Tivoli Gardens with a postmark with a Piccard balloon, and it's actually signed by Don Piccard. Going back to Augustus, his son Jacques was who'd helped him design and work on the balloons. Had worked on the original and with the bathyscaphe. Took the bathyscaphe and it became known as the Trieste, named the Trieste with funding from the Navy. And in 1960, Jacques Piccard and Don Welsh actually reached the floor of the Mariana Trench, located in the North Pacific Ocean. And they actually went down to 10,916 meters deep. Many people didn't actually believe him. He actually talked about creatures that he'd actually seen at that depth, but it was mostly disbelieved. But obviously, later on, they did subsequent dives, and it was vindicated. A very nice photograph there of Augustus and his son, with his own patented bifocal glasses that he'd developed for his own personal use. Here are some stamps showing the Trieste and Jacques, and here is a very nice sort of press photo I have with his and a little signature of Jacques Piccard. Here are some other submersibles that they developed. One is the Mesoscape, which is the passenger carrying submarine. It was launched at the Lucerne exhibition in '64. It was the star of the show, took several thousand people underwater, showing people the depths of Lake Lucerne. And Jacques Piccard carried on developing different forms of submersible, one of which was the Forel. Forel was a famous limnologist, someone who's interested in inland water, fjords, lakes, ponds, and such like. And here's a couple of examples of stamps and miniature sheets showing Jacques and this Forel. Here's a nice cover signed by Jacques Piccard. It was actually for the Society Jules Verne. The cover was carried by balloon and by submarine, and the submarine was the F.A. Forel, signed by the pilot. Here's another cover again showing the Forel, and again it's quite nice because this one has a couple of stamps from Switzerland, both having the balloon and the Trieste on its record-breaking depth dive, and again it's signed by the Jacques Piccard. Jacques had a son, a chap called Bertrand Piccard, and again he was a entrepreneur, explorer. He was actually competed, I think it was hang gliding, competed and was actually a European champion. but one of his challenges was ballooning and altitude and long distance records. And you may remember him from Breitlinger, and you can see these are both souvenir postcards showing Bertrand and the Breitlinger balloon. And here are some stamps reflecting the record-breaking trip from Guyana. Some nice examples of pictures of the Breitlinger balloon. The Monaco one's quite nice because it actually is a stamp on stamp. It actually shows the Monaco stamp with Piccard's record altitude breaking stamp, but also the Breitlinger world record circumnavigation stamp. And here's another sort of souvenir cover showing the Bertrand that's after he completed his record, and a miniature sheet from Nicaragua, which is signed by Bertrand. And if you heard me at the beginning of my interest in Leonardo, he manages to sneak in on one of the stamps there in the middle of that miniature sheet. Bertrand didn't stop there. He has continued to set records, break records. One of them was the Solar Impulse, which was the first solar-powered plane to circumnavigate the world. And here's some examples of stamps that were issued from the Isle of Man and Switzerland, supporting and celebrating that fact. And just to go back, I rather spoilt it there with the control of the slides. My apologies; these don't seem to be a bit juddery. But just as a sort of aside, does he remind you of anyone? And you probably all saw who he reminds you of, Professor Calculus. You might say that's a bit of a cheek. Hergé actually knew and saw Auguste Piccard in Brussels. He actually held that teaching appointment in Brussels, and Hergé actually spotted him in the street. And later on, he actually remarked that he'd actually copied Professor Calculus as a model of Piccard. And one thing he did point out, that as Augustus Piccard was very, very tall, he had to make him a lot smaller, otherwise his cartoon strip wouldn't have fitted on the page. As an aside, in French, Professor Calculus is known as Professor Trifon Tournesol, which actually, and excuse my French, but it actually means basically Professor Trifon Sunflower. And Trifon was the name of Hergé's plumber. Just shows that if you're looking for inspiration, look to people who are close to you. So I thought these were quite nice, and stamps from France and Belgium supporting that. And here's another connection to Piccard. You might remember, any Star Trek fans in the audience may recognize Captain Jean-Luc Piccard in The Next Generation. Roddenberry actually said that it was his inspiration from the twin brothers, and obviously from Augustus and Jean-Félix Piccard, he came up to this character Jean-Luc Piccard. And in fact, in some of the series, there's actually been implied that he is a descendant of one of the brothers. And here is a miniature sheet from the Nevis with some character positions in terms of doing it. I did find some other stamps, just to show you, you can find stamps from almost any theme. And someone mentioned cats earlier on. If I can, here's some example of captains of Star Trek, which includes Jean-Luc Picard. And then this very strange set from the Marshall Islands, where each of the members of the crew of the Next Generation Star Trek are likened to cats. And rather unfortunately, Jean-Luc Picard is one of the bald cats, as you can see on the top left. And now, just to see if the technology will really work, you may know about Hennessy cognac. A bit like Guinness, they do some very artistic advertising, and this was one they did regarding the Piccard. So hopefully we'll push the internet to its limits. Well, thank you very much for listening.
That was great. Thanks, Les. That was
Yeah,
really
well
good.
done. Yes.
I rather like that. And